thanks to a variety of town committees, including our local emergency planning committee. And she's a registered nurse by profession. And many of you who have tuned in for these hearings know that you saw her partner in crime and husband earlier, so they're very involved in the town. We thank you so much. Public health is occupying all the news headlines of late, so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So, I guess to start, the Board of Health, just as a recap of what we do. We do a mix of public health tasks, from food establishments to camps, hazardous waste, on-site septic systems, housing. We get involved with rabies as well, the clinics. One illness, the public health nurse does vaccinations, flu vaccinations, and blood pressure clinics. Anything that's public health related, our department is charged to be part of. And I'd like to think we do a good job.
You absolutely do.
Oh, thank you.
Can you speak to the town, you were going to update us on the clotting kits. So where do we stand with that in terms of rolling them out?
Yeah.
We're going to begin in March at Town Hall.
Okay.
We've spoken with Mr. Gazinski, and after that, Clyde Brown. And we will go from there.
So turning to your budget, sir. Amen.
So you can go right to the budget.
That's the description of what we do. I think it's probably the
Okay,
third or
you
fourth
keep
slide.
going.
Big one more. There we go. So, everything, expenses part of the budget stayed the same level funded. The only thing that has increased is the salary, which was more contractual than anything else. So we've kept the expense side pretty much the same, I think, for the last few years.
Which is impressive, given that public health has become more complex.
Right. That's true.
I'm curious, do you all get involved in mental health services at all?
If you look at that budget line, you see we have a mental health that we've been paying. I feel like I've been on the Board of Health as long as Paul Revere, who's actually started Board of Health in Massachusetts.
You did?
Yeah,
Oh.
he's one institute.
So you were riding on the horse right next to him?
I think I was, yeah. That's why feeding it between the
You're the one who actually got through, right?
Yeah.
But that is a hangover, and that is historically, I believe the current name is ARC, which is a nonprofit agency that assists mentally disabled. And historically, they were funded by boards of health. And I know in tough times, we've really struggled to keep some of our money going towards that. So literally, the only funding we have for mental health is that money that we've been able to continue to give for them to help provide the services they provide throughout this general area, as well as Millis. Other than that, we really...
$1,100?
It's not much.
No, it's not. And we heard the fire chief talk about a suicide prevention program and...
Yeah, I think, in terms of, Millis did have a social worker,
Right.
a full-time social worker, a long time ago. So I think mental health kind of issues would look to the common sense thing. We integrate with almost every department in town. I think, we need to think about, because our aging population, I think someday we probably do need to look into how we could do that. But I think a more pressing need for us for the future, as we've talked about development and the aging of the town, brain of the town, is we have 10 hours of the public health nurse. And I see that our needs, the needs of the aging population, probably we will be at some point asking, to me that's the first place we need to ask for more staff. Um,
That makes sense, population growth, the residential
I think that's
targeted
what it-
communities.
Yeah, and we're very fortunate right now, we have a wonderful public health nurse who's very active in, she's working with the fire department, we're working with Council on Aging, so, you know, we're doing the best we can with those 10 hours. So that's where I see, you know, we're essentially a budget of supplies and salaries.
Right.
And, you know, so with the board, you don't ever want to see us come back for additional money, because it will be because there's a problem. I mean, we have no funding for any potential problems.
Right.
If that's okay, it makes sense that if there is one, if we get a coronavirus patient, who unfortunately was in Wuhan and lives in Millis, we might need some additional, almost surge funding, like with a disaster.
Right.
I don't really see any other way to do that.
Well, there are mechanisms in an emergency for the town to be able to
Right.
authorize funding. We'd have to contact the state, but
Right,
we
so we-
can get emergency funding authorized through that process in a true emergency situation.
And that's the process we
Yeah.
utilize.
What do we use advertising for?
Well, we were involved with, we had, one of the things we did with, you know, our revolving fund for food inspections, restaurant inspections, is the state mandated that we're responsible for the food quality of kind of all the nonprofits and churches with no funding. And one of the things we always wanted to do was offer key people in organizations in Millis that do a lot of that type of thing, basic education for food safety. And those programs are expensive. How much was it, John?
Close to $1,000.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not something that if you're a voluntary church, that, you know, so we were able to offer a class for members of nonprofit communities in Millis who were doing food events to get somebody trained in basic food safety. So for example, that's something we advertise. So basically, advertising is mostly for our programs.
I'm just wondering if there's a way to do partnerships or something like that.
I think we already do.
Yeah.
Anything we advertise that involves school children, we do, and the school system is very good at helping us get the word out. The police chief is our Facebook go-to guy.
No, that was
Because
coming up next.
we-
Couldn't wait.
We voted, I think, ahead of this curve about Facebook as a board, 2-1, as I recall, not to have a Facebook page, for a multitude of reasons. The most practical one being, if we need any support right now for what we do, I'd say it would be IT support, which we're getting, but I would say that, you know.
Yeah, I would say the webpage works quite well. The
Yeah,
town
but I
webpage
mean-
At this point.
So we didn't even have the personnel to even consider doing that. And I think in retrospect, that was probably a wise idea.
But if you needed to announce some event, flu shots or something, it could go through the town as a
We
whole.
find no problems, all the other more adept, including the town website, we use them all.
Okay.
I'm looking at the budget you submitted, or at least you're submitting for recommendations. There are a few things I have questions on. One, you don't have anything in here for equipment. And the question, at least the one I have, I can't read that from this angle, I'm sorry. And so, whether it's IT or any other kinds of equipment, I mean, I know you want a printer, for example, which makes sense, and you're gonna need some other things. Why is there nothing on the line item for equipment?
I think historically it just hasn't been there. There's definitely, there could be a need for that at any point in time, especially if you mentioned IT.
Well, you already, I know for a fact you're asking for it, so.
We actually, so we have some revolving funds. And one of the things we talked about, which, to find a way to purchase something like that through the money that we have in our revolving fund. Because we certainly use the color printer for dissemination of information.
Sure.
Most recent one was Triple E, where color was key.
I'm not at all complaining about it. My concern is that we understand in our budget these expense items, regardless of how they come. You can identify the funding mechanism, but at least we ought to be aware of them. And to that, I'm going to ask a couple of other questions. What, the sharps and so on, you don't have anything in here. How do we deal with these types of programs?
That's the design.
Okay, well, no, it's not, it's us, we pay for it.
Oh, we do?
So, oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, the immunization.
So,
Yeah.
SHARPS was again another mandated federal program. You can see there's less than 2 full-time equivalents of staff in this office. So it's clear we don't do everything we do without the tremendous help of volunteers in the town of Millis.
Right.
And historically, we've had just great support. Some of the people in this room have volunteered for us. The other core group that's volunteered for us is a group of nurses in Millis. They've been incredible. Because we do a flu clinic every year, we can collect revenue. We buy flu vaccine, and for the insured people, we collect money. And that is a revolving fund which we created in the last, I'd say 10 years.
Okay.
So when we were mandated to pay for sharps collection, which the fire department nicely administrates for us, we're using that revolving fund money.
I guess, again, I'll turn to our financial director. I think it would be useful when I see line items like this to understand we are in fact funding them,
Yes.
but we're funding them through a revenue source that we really don't see here. I don't know if you'll even see it, but the
Yeah.
bottom line is, as a town, we ought to be aware that in fact there is expense, but we have a revenue source that seems to be covering that expense, and that's all I'm looking at this point.
Okay.
Thank you, I don't mean to,
No,
there are others, but I'm beginning to get the gist of what's happening.
Well, perhaps the real answer to that, the broader answer, is some consolidated accounting for revolving funds in general. In summary, it's not just your department,
Right,
but other
it's all-
departments have revolving funds. And to be able to report back to the residents of town that revolving funds are generating whatever they're generating, $200,000 this year, which we're using to offset costs so that the taxpayer doesn't bear that burden.
That's really what I was getting at. I was going to leave it there, but we have other things we're going to have to identify as grants and so on that become important, because in certain cases, those grants represent a substantial funding source for things that we would otherwise have to pay using town revenues. Okay, I won't.
What I would like to ask you to do, as you sort of go through your review of programs and whatnot, to take a look at what kind of public health initiatives you think we should be thinking about in a connection with the marijuana HCA payments.
Yeah.
There's a form, but we need to get some input from public health about what kinds of, whether it's training, awareness, whatever is going on in the public health arena. We have an opportunity, at least in the short run here, to utilize some of that funding, because it directly relates to the fact that, we have marijuana businesses in our town. So I just ask you to take a close look at that at some point. What we can't tell you is the timing of when money might actually become available, but we need to be, holistic in our approach here, and I'm sure there are public health issues that this brings to the fore, and we ought to be, mindful of those.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, we wish-
Education is key.
We wish we could use some of that money for vaping, which we see right now as a major public health problem.
Well, it's certainly not too late for them to put in a form. If you want to submit a form within the next week or two, just if it's educational funding for vaping or
But
programs.
we might not be able to do it because we're talking about tobacco products.
Well, we'll try to be as liberal as we can
Okay.
be. On the other hand,
If you think it's even remotely close, I would submit it,
Yeah,
and then
okay.
let us determine if
We'd
it
love
fits
to,
or not. That way,
yes.
it might fit.
Yeah.
It might fit in.
and frankly, if you want to call your legislator and tell them that the proposals at the legislature now to be more restrictive on the use of HCA money is not a good idea.
Right.
That's something clearly being
That's coming down the pipe.
pushed. Well, there's a proposal right now to increase the reporting obligation for the town, showing the nexus between the payment and the impact on the town. And frankly, this is editorial opinion, the industry's clearly pushing this to try and reduce HCA payments. That's not reasonable.
Right,
There's my
and
little,
The commission is trying to take over.
and the commission is trying to take over the administration of these things, so
the
that
whole thing.
it's not a good outcome.
Right.
From Millis's point of view, that's for
Right.
sure.
I would say along those lines also, with the aging, the deliberate aging of the housing, the residency growth, and to include the assisted living. I think that anything from a mental health support standpoint, maybe it's programmatic through the Council on Aging. With respect to life transition, I know this is something I can speak to very personally, is in my own family right now, and it's a really, really hard thing to answer, and just because you live in assisted living, that has nothing whatsoever to do with what your mental health resources are, counseling resources. So I just wanted to put that out
And I
there.
think that's something that we would have to do with the Council on Aging.
Yeah,
That they would be the main focus.
and I think programmatically to have your expertise and maybe coalesce mental health resources between the two. Some, whether we're bringing in somebody or just identifying resources, people who are gonna be new, who are gonna be moving to town, and they're gonna be saying to us, who in the area is in this line of work, even if we were just a source of connection. I know that's something I'm actually working on right now, where I've gone to the equivalent of the Council on Aging, where one of my parents is, and they have a robust list of, okay, we know who those people are. And they also happen to have programs that are hosted there. So I could see people not necessarily coming through the Council on Aging door to get that information, they might come to your door. So I think what you do is great, and I also want to say that Kathy is also a member of the local emergency planning committee,
So
so,
is John.
and John, so thank you both so much for being there in the event of something that, we don't want to have happen, we're ready for if it does.
One quick last question regarding triple E and Lyme disease. Are you going to get information out on how people can recognize, and also is there any vaccine or anything coming down
For AAA,
for triple E?
we probably should expect AAA will be a problem again this year, because that is a virus which has increased incidence in clusters of 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
So, we probably will need to do all the things we did last year to some extent or another. And that probably is mostly weather dependent on how it evolves. I personally have been doing Lyme disease outreach for more than 15 years. To be honest, we've also talked about, we have concerns. That's really a continuing education issue in protection and prevention. We actually have been discussing the fact that there's been a proliferation of private companies that will come spray your yards, and they highly, advertise for ticks. And we have some concerns about that in a town that's 1/3 wetland, since the products they're using are much more longer acting than, for example, with the mosquito control board, Norfolk County Mosquito Control Board uses. And there is really no control over application and looking at that wetlands are avoided. So that is actually, it's a double-edged sword. We're concerned about the problem in the current method of treating it, that, there are some effects of using those chemicals in your yard.
Well, I'm just suggesting that it's probably useful to have some forums where you talk with the community.
Which we've done and we will do again.
That's fine. Thank you.
Just going back for a second to triple E, because it sort of crept up on us last year. Now you're giving us reasonably fair warning that we should expect it to be back. That required, or your advice at the time in terms of the use of public outdoor facilities, like school practices and whatnot, was to shut down the fields basically at 6 o'clock, which is dusk. Would you expect that to be a similar, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that's a practical reaction to this, right?
Yes, and I think right now, I don't see any other response. you know, nobody's come up with a way to get rid of the mosquitoes or change their behavior.
Well, right, I mean, there's, in terms of our board, I mean, we have the responsibility to either open or close the fields.
Yeah.
And, you know, so we'll look again for
Guidance.
you folks to say, you know, if we get the whatever color it was,
Yeah.
it's time to do that. And we want to make sure people get a little bit of advance warning to the extent we can. But that, to me, is the only practical response for a town to try and minimize the impact. The second issue we had last year, which was a little different, and we had some discussion on our board, was licenses by this board to private groups who look to host events after 6 o'clock.
And it's
And
something.
this was a very real thing that we discussed. And from a policy point of view, I'd like to receive, you know, some thoughts from the Board of Health as to how we might proceed with that. Because we're not the experts, and we're trying to make sure that people who, you know, are looking to use those things for really worthy causes
Yeah.
understand what the restrictions are, and get a little bit of advance notice as to what they should do for their own planning purposes.
So the story of AAA is you need young birds, you need baby birds. Mosquitoes transmitted to baby birds, it's essentially a cold in birds. Older birds are immune, so you need a crop of baby birds. So there is a time issue with AAA. AAA, we won't know if it's going to be the problem, which was historical last year. That, again, until probably late July. So we need to understand that there will not be any answers until we see the mosquito, you know, they see the measurements of the virus
Yeah.
in adult mosquitoes and in which species of adult mosquitoes. The risk for transmission of AAA is historically greatest in August and September.
Okay.
So I think one of the things we have to do is think about those things in August. You know, events outside in the evening in August or September of next year. We need to,
Okay.
that's
what I'm-
all we can do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's information that we have, and we need to think about acting upon. Okay, thank you.
And probably should be shared with the school department as well as the rec department.
And they're very aware of it. I will say the school was ahead of the curve on this last year.
Okay.
Oh, there was, there was very good collaboration.
Yeah,
And, you know, I can tell you that we would see that programs at 6 o'clock stopped on this field. So people, that's the private groups, the rec groups, the school groups, and we really appreciate their cooperation. But to the extent that we can give them a little bit, I know we can't give them advance notice, but if our policy is that if we get the green light or the red light or whatever it was, we're gonna do this, then at least they'll know. And that's for us to
Yeah.
decide.
yeah. It's gonna be August and September,
Okay,
evening outside events.
okay.
I don't have any other questions. Anybody else have questions, comments, concerns, well wishes?
Can I just make a plug?
Yeah.
Since adult learning is people listen to things when they think they need to know. Right now, there's a virus going around the world that's getting a lot of attention. That's essentially a relative of the cold virus. And I just want to let people know that there's currently a virus in the United States that is transmitted the same way, is more deadly, and currently there are 6,600 deaths in the United States, and that's the flu virus. And that will continue on historically into March and late April. We still have flu vaccine. If anyone would like a flu shot, it's not too late. Call the Board of Health, leave your name and your number, and we will get you a flu shot. In terms of the coronavirus, we know a lot about how cold viruses are transmitted. The number one thing is to wash your hands. There's actually been a research study that's posted on our board that for cold viruses, you don't even need soap. That using plain water and mechanically getting the virus off your hands is more effective than the gels. So it's scary because it's new, but we know a lot about how to preventing it, and you know, simply washing your hands and covering your cough are the two major things you can do, or having Kleenex.
No,
So
but
you shouldn't walk
coughing,
around without
not
it.
into your hand, but into your arm.
Yeah, so, you know, that has been shown and will help. We're not concerned about the coronavirus showing up in Millis tomorrow. The flu virus is already here, and the simple things you can do can prevent you from getting either one.
Excellent. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for coming.
Thank you.
John,
Thank
any
you.
other comments? Any other-
No, just, we have